The Columbine High School massacre was the first and most significant school shooting in America to date. The Columbine massacre resulted in the death of 12 students and 1 teacher, including the shooters, along with 20 other injured victims. The Columbine shooting occurred in Jefferson County, Colorado, on April 20, 1999. When Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold walked in at 11:19 a.m. and began to open fire before committing suicide. This was marked as one of the most tragic events in U.S. history, but triumph followed soon after, with new regulations set in by Colorado and the rest of the nation regarding gun control and overall safety. Schools and students across the nation have been affected by the shootings and had to adapt to a new era, which consists of having to be ready for the worst. This results in many schools and students now having to be prepared in case of future shootings occurring, in which many people across the country have taken matters into their own hands to ensure that schools become more safe and that students are protected. Months before the Columbine shooting, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris demonstrated concerning signs and behavior that hinted at their future actions. Essays and conversations by both students were investigated and illustrated problematic conduct. Dylan Klebold submitted a grim essay for his creative writing class 2 months before the shooting, in which the storyline and details resembled many ideas from their deadly plan. His essay describes a story where one killer, mostly similar to Harris, brutally murders his preps. As Dylan is a bystander who recounts what he sees and experiences, this was a huge red flag, which was ultimately ignored by officials after Dylan's teacher voiced her concerns, and at the time should have been looked into. Certain topics, such as the one that Dylan addressed in his story, were questionable and concerning. However, at the time, there wasn't a huge emphasis on certain issues, unlike today regarding mental health. To this day, the medical field struggles to truly understand psychopaths' motives and how to help them, so it must have been a more difficult topic and situation to deal with years ago. Eric Harris also exemplified ideas of killing off the whole human race when he communicated with a girl in a chat room for a series of time. Eric Harris printed the 3 chat rooms and kept them for himself, and later Jefferson County released them. In the 3 chat rooms, he had casual conversations with a girl that seemed relatively innocent at first, but as the conversation continued to develop, the topics that Harris introduced became more sinister and dark. However, Peter Langman, Ph.D., explained how Eric's ideologies arose from his interests and influences, which include Adolf Hitler and Thomas Hobbes. These were not the only hints of their concerning behavior. According to Park Dietz, who is in the threat assessment group, he believed that both Dylan and Eric had so much sadness and anger stored inside them from bullying and other external factors. However, he said that their self-inflicted immersion in violent imagery were due to their anger and depression reaching its highest point, which lead them to follow the most violent images that society's culture has to offer. He hypothesized that this hatred and rage lead them to follow the model of mass murder and subsequently lead them to think that mass murder was the only solution to their problems. A year before the Columbine shooting, Dylan wrote in Eric's yearbook, which presented elements of the plan that had already been developed. It was thorough and detailed, with writings and drawings that depicted horrific scenes, such as murder, and proceeds to talk about hell on earth. Also, perhaps one of the most interesting pieces of evidence found from Eric Harris's website is a 5-page rant, which listed everything he hated and why. They were each very specific and elaborate, and it was a clear sign of anger and depression, which could have been better addressed. These pieces of evidence helped investigators embark on Harris and Klebold's dangerous behavior and the apparent signs that Harris and Klebold demonstrated that would eventually lead up to the horrific Columbine High School shooting. Prior to the brutal attack, Harris and Klebold prepared a plan, to perfect their horrific act of terror in which the public slowly became aware of. According to Sally Blanchard, a school district official, she stated what people saw in the school were that these two were going to classes every day. They had friends, they were turning in assignments, they were working towards higher grades in their classes, they were planning the future. This shows how, at first, the two teenagers seemed like normal kids who were focused in school and working hard for a bright future. However, this was not the case, and many odd signs began to appear. One student from Columbine High School, named Brooks Brown, experienced a death threat from Eric Harris over a year before the Columbine shooting. Harris had his own webpage where he had written his thoughts, philosophies, and ideas. Brown stated how he used to be friends with Harris until Harris threw a block of ice at Brown's car and chipped it. Harris proceeded to post a death threat against Brown, which Brown later showed to his parents, and they filed a report to the police. The police said they had enough evidence to draft a search warrant on Harris's home, but it never went through. In the months before the shooting, the killers kept track of journal entries, to-do lists, and a hit list. They would mark off every item that they had gotten in their journal, which they would use for the massacre. Harris and Klebold would create illustrations of how they wanted to look, the guns they would use, and how they would conceal their weapons on the day of the shooting. For a school assignment, they were asked to make a promotional video for a business, which the boys named their assignment Hitman for Hire. A former student recounted how Harris and Klebold had a friend dress up as an average Columbine student who would talk about wanting a certain student dead, and they filmed each other running around and killing people. Dylan and Eric were two of the hitmen in the movie who were dressed in black trench coats. Dylan and Eric began to collect and stockpile weapons for the shooting. They collected a series of guns, knives, and different products and substances to make bombs. The boys also made profiles which mentioned their plan of April 20, as well as how everyone would be sorry that day. This marked the beginning of a long scheme which they would soon play out on April 20, 1999. Former Columbine student Melissa Miller recounted her story that day of the massacre. She had a clear sight of what had been happening and what Dylan and Eric were doing. She was ducking behind a truck that morning in the park lot and saw that the two boys were wearing black trench coats and had guns in their hands. At first, she thought that it was a prank and that they must have been paintball guns, but as they started shooting students outside the school, she realized it was not a prank and that students were actually being attacked and injured. Students were hit by the ruthless bullets shot by Dylan and Eric, and they helplessly fell to the ground. Anne-Marie Hochpolter was one of the few students who was shot outside of the school, in which she was shot 2 times, but survived after a 4-hour surgery and now lives as a paraplegic. Melissa crouched down behind a wheel as Dylan and Eric began throwing pipe bombs that exploded in seconds, releasing shrapnel. Within minutes, the shooters had moved their deadly invasion inside the school, and Melissa went to get help. The 2 shooters planted a bomb at Wadsworth Boulevard Field and successfully went off, but the bombs inside Columbine High School did not have the same fate. At 11:19 a.m., Dylan and Eric began anxious and tired of waiting and began to open fire. They celebrated their attack as Dylan went inside the cafeteria to check on the bombs, and Eric proceeded to shoot a teacher and a student. Faculty of the school moved quickly and helped move students from the cafeteria to a safer place. Eric and the on-site police officer fired at each other, and then Eric joined Dylan in the cafeteria, where they soon went up the stairs to the 2nd floor, in which they opened fire on anyone they saw in the halls. They carelessly fired at the building when the halls were empty, and they continued into the library. Eric began shooting down on the front counter, and students and a few teachers crouched down under tables. One by one, Eric and Dylan taunted those inside the library and ruthlessly killed them as they approached the table they were under. One of the victims was Patrick Ireland, who was shot twice as he was trying to help someone close to him who was also shot. After 7.5 minutes, Dylan and Eric left the library and they continued to the science room, where a bomb went off and ignited a small fire. Then they went to the cafeteria, where the bombs planted still haven't went off. The rest of their movements were random, but then they returned to the library. Minutes after 12:08 p.m., alarms in the school went off, and Eric and Dylan shot themselves in the head, which resulted in their self-inflicted death. Once the horrible actions of Dylan and Eric had ended, students, families, teachers, and communities were deeply impacted. Everyone had a different experience and effect from the terror caused by the two shooters, but all of them were significant and lasting. After time to process and heal, students began to open up about the nightmarish day that would be remembered forever. Former student Jana Buchel became traumatized to the core and has been unable to live peacefully. She recounted how she went to Elitch Gardens, which is a popular amusement park in Denver, Colorado, and she was waiting in line to go on a roller coaster as she heard a loud pop. She fell to the floor in the fetal position, thinking that a gun was fired, and people began to laugh at her until she mentioned that she went to Columbine. Former student Patrick Ireland suffered from 2 gunshots and became known as the boy in the window for a picture that captured his escape to safety. He recalled how it took him 3 hours to escape as he passed the dead bodies of classmates and continued to go in and out of consciousness. However, Ireland remained positive despite the tragic events, and he explained how he knew the importance of regaining control and continuing on with life. Meanwhile, reporters and news stations struggled to figure out what to film live and what to show the public as new information began to come in. They knew they had to remain in the control room to supervise and decide what shots to put on the air. The story lasted 10 days and was seemingly one of the most intense stories that Denver stations had ever covered. They had to make quick decisions, and covering Columbine tested the resources that each station had. All students had different reactions to Columbine. Some students, such as Kendra Curry, decided to forgive Harris and Caybold and explained how it was not her rightful place to judge them and how it was only God's place to do so. Other students were left pondering why anyone would commit such a terrible act, and they struggled to find closure. Each student was affected in a different way, which lead to personal changes and long-lasting scars, both physical and emotional. On August 12, 2003, impacted families proceeded to file a wrongful death lawsuit against the parents of Dylan and Eric, claiming that they should have known what their kids were doing before the shooting. This demonstrates the different levels of trauma, anger, and sadness that people struggled with, and how they eagerly yearned for justice. Also, former Principal Frank DeAngelis recounted how he questioned his faith, but a local church leader helped him and told him that he should focus on rebuilding the community. He remained principal of Columbine High School for over 18 years before he retired. In the years since, the number of school shootings has increased from Virginia Tech to Parkland. DeAngelis has created an unfortunate bond with those in similar situations. DeAngelis since then has voiced his concerns of this rising problem and says he encourages the massive student-led movements, but more must be done to fix the issue. In the past 2 decades, there have been over 200 school shootings in America. Over time, people have been realizing school shootings have been realizing an impactful and dangerous part of today's society. Students of all ages, even those who were not born at the time of Columbine, have started to take action for their own safety. On April 20, 2018, students in New York City walked out of school, which was billed as the National School Walkout, to protest against gun violence and the effect it has had on our society. Students reported that the Parkland shooting in February was their tipping point and encouraged them to take a stand for what they believe in. This was a big step towards change and demonstrated to the world that students, teachers, and parents have opened their eyes to see and how there needs to be more gun control and overall safety procedures as the number of school shootings and threats continue to rise. As Sue Klebold stated, she was unaware of the severity of her son's mental health and how people cannot prevent violence without taking into account the depression and brain dysfunction that also takes place in a decision to commit violence. Since Columbine, the number of mental health programs and violence prevention programs/strategies increased considerably over the years. These changes may seem minor, but they will have one of the biggest impacts on student safety and protection. As more regulations are made and people become more aware, the world will become a better place. Dylan and Eric took so much time to plan out an act of hatred, but love responded instantly.